So the first thing I would say is that I think the inauguration kind of set the right tone for what is going to obviously be a really difficult moment for the country with the multiple crises that we're facing. I would say the event itself was in some ways unusual. Of course, not just in terms of the logistics with the COVID pandemic and the social distancing and masking and the lack of, much of a normal inaugural crowd, but also just in terms of some of the ceremonial aspects. So I think, for example, the poem by Amanda Gorman was really interesting and stylistically and a really kind of moving portrayal of this kind of new direction for the country toward unity, toward healing, toward justice that's consistent, at least with the direction the Biden administration is trying to steer us. I would say first and foremost, and this is no surprise, but pandemic relief, both in terms of health, including public health, and getting the vaccination program working more quickly and more smoothly and more effectively, but also in terms of economic stimulus and aid to small businesses, aid to families who are struggling, and even aid to state and local governments, which people often don't think about, but those are really big sources of jobs and employment in the country, and they've really been hit very, very hard by the economic crisis brought on the pandemic. And then climate change is also extremely important. And, Biden has done a bit already with executive orders and re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement, but doing something to try to get some major legislation through Congress, which will be, of course, really difficult. I think it will be a relationship of personal respect and a give and take, and even, of course, personal friendship. And they have a long history together, both from serving in the Senate and when Biden was vice president. Of course, what I would say to kind of put a caveat on that is that, when Biden was in the Senate, that was a very different era in American political history when personal relationships across party lines could often get a lot more done legislatively in terms of policy than is the case today. So I think the big question will be, how far can the kind of McConnell-Biden friendship / relationship go in terms of actually getting bipartisan policy cooperation, at least on big issues? I would say overall, he's picked strong leaders and competent administrators. He seems to be focusing a lot on this idea of professionalism, especially management ability. I also think gender, racial, and other forms of diversity are clearly a priority for the Biden administration in these positions. Now, this is, of course, symbolic, which is an important aspect of it, but also substantively, it can be important to get expert people in major leadership positions who bring different perspectives from their own social background. And that can make a significant difference in terms of actually, the business of government and how government responds to public problems. I do think that's possible. And I think that of the kind of major kinds of legislation that might be on the table, it's one that has the best chance of getting some bipartisan cooperation to actually get through. I think that infrastructure is, in some ways, infrastructure is a great subject for bipartisan cooperation, partly because it's important from all perspectives to the economy and to society, but also because really the devil is in the details, to use a cliche. Infrastructure, how to actually accomplish that. Sometimes the parties differ a lot on that. So what the details of that will be a really interesting point of debate, and how much role government spending is going to play, how much role kind of private sector incentives will play, stuff like that. But I do think that that's a possibility, and something that is, most policy analysts and just ordinary people would say is sorely needed. Well, one thing that I would just say is that I can't overstate how unusual from a historical perspective these circumstances are that the administration is stepping into. I mean, it's going to be extremely politically difficult for the Biden administration to be successful in many of these policy issues. especially in terms of this major action that requires legislative approval, climate change being one example of that. So, with a large percentage of Americans not really even believing in the validity of the election results in terms of the numbers themselves, the vote tallies, that's a very unusual situation in American history, at least modern history. I think what the Democrats are saying and what they're going to say is that we need to do both, and that they would say that, look, we would prefer not to have to do an impeachment trial, but we have to because there has to be a precedent set that behavior that from the former president that they consider well outside the norms or well outside the expectations of what we should have in a democracy needs to be held accountable for. But we also want to focus on these policy priorities. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think that the policy action cannot wait no matter what. I mean, we're in such a crisis situation particularly with the pandemic and the economic fallout from it, that the impeachment trial, if it really becomes a distraction from policy action, then that's going to be not a good thing for anybody.